All right, so today we're going to take a deep dive into a pretty heavy topic,
Yeah.
white supremacy.
hmm
And we're going to be using a recent online article that goes into some of the details of this. But I think, it's one of those things that it's important to understand how this operates.
Absolutely.
And we don't want to overwhelm anybody with just a bunch of facts and figures, but we're going to try to pinpoint
Right.
the most insightful takeaways.
Yeah. And I think what's really key for us to emphasize is we're not pretending to have all the answers here.
Yes.
What we want to do is really give our listeners a clear picture of how white supremacy is operating historically and presently in our daily lives.
Okay, so right off the bat, let's just go to how this article defines white supremacy.
Hmm.
What is white supremacy?
Yeah, it defines white supremacy as an ideology that promotes the belief that white people are inherently superior to people of other races.
Okay.
And I think what's really important to note here is that this is not just a modern day concept. No. This is something that is deeply rooted in our past, in our historical context.
So when we talk about historical context, where do we even begin with something like that?
Well, we have to think about things like colonialism
Mm-hmm.
and slavery.
Right.
In order to justify these atrocities, there had to be a powerful narrative in place to dehumanize the victims. And white supremacy really provided that narrative. It was a justification for the exploitation and the brutalization of entire populations of people.
Yeah, it's chilling to think about how these ideas from the past are somehow still,
Right.
present and being adapted.
And they're adapting.
Yeah.
They're changing with the times.
Yeah.
And that's what makes it so insidious, is that we're not talking about, just burning crosses and wearing white hoods anymore.
Right.
I mean, groups like the KKK, while they still exist, they've realized that they need to evolve in order to maintain their influence.
So they've traded their hoods for something a bit more subtle.
Exactly. They've moved away from those overt symbols
Right.
and are now focusing more on things like infiltrating local politics, lobbying for policies that uphold their agenda, and using dog whistle rhetoric that appeals to a broader audience.
So it's almost like they're trying to mainstream these beliefs,
Precisely.
make them seem less extreme.
And more palatable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's really scary to think about.
It is.
But I guess let's move into the modern day manifestations of this, because we're talking about, it's not just about, fringe groups and rallies anymore.
Absolutely not.
How does this ideology show up in everyday life?
Well, you're absolutely right. It's woven into the fabric of our society in ways that we don't often think about, and it often operates on a systemic level.
Okay.
So, think about institutions like law enforcement, the
Right.
criminal justice system, even our education system.
Okay, we hear the term systemic racism a lot.
Yeah.
But what does that actually mean in the context of this article?
Yeah. So the article really does a good job of outlining how this shows up in our society, and it highlights some alarming statistics.
Okay.
For instance, the disproportionate scrutiny and incarceration rates for minorities, especially black men.
Yeah.
It's not just about individual prejudice. It's about how these biases become embedded in the policies, the
Right.
practices.
So it's less about an intentional act of racism and more about
Systems.
a system that's in place that continues to perpetuate this
Like I said,
inequality.
that's the key takeaway here.
Yeah.
And it goes beyond institutions, too.
Yeah.
Think about cultural narratives, the stories that we tell ourselves about who we are and what our history is.
So like the media's role in shaping
So exactly.
the perception.
The article points out how the media often perpetuates harmful stereotypes. They focus on white individuals and achievements while downplaying the contributions of people of color.
Right.
It's this constant reinforcement of this idea that white is the default.
Standard.
So we've got these blatant displays of hate from groups like the KKK, and then you've got this more subtle systemic level that most people probably don't even.
Exactly. It's like a double whammy.
Yeah.
It's operating on multiple levels. And I think that's what's so important to understand, is that in order for us to dismantle white supremacy, we have to understand
Right.
both of these levels.
Okay, so now let's talk about the appeal, because this is deeply rooted.
Yes.
Why are people drawn to this?
Yeah, that's a great question.
What is the draw?
One factor that the article really points to is the power of group identity.
Okay.
You know, we as humans are social creatures. We crave belonging. We crave community. White supremacist groups really tap into that need. They offer this sense of community and belonging.
It's like a twisted sense of camaraderie.
Yeah, exactly.
Built on a foundation of hate.
Right.
Yeah.
And let's not forget the role of fear and anxiety, particularly around things like changing demographics and cultural landscapes.
Right. You know, some people feel threatened by these shifts. And white supremacist groups, they exploit those fears.
Right.
They offer a distorted sense of security and a scapegoat for their anxieties.
It's like the world's changing. It's scary.
Right.
But we've got the answer, and it's them.
You hit the nail on the head.
Yeah.
And it's not just about individual psychology. There's a sociological element here.
Okay.
Socialization plays a huge role in this.
So if you're brought up in this, if you're immersed in this type of ideology from your family,
Absolutely.
your community.
It becomes your norm.
Yeah.
It becomes the water that you swim in. And it's very hard to break free from that way of thinking, especially when you're surrounded by people who are constantly reinforcing those beliefs.
Yeah. And nowadays, I'm thinking social media probably plays a big role in this.
Oh, absolutely.
Too.
That's where things get really interesting.
Yeah.
The internet, especially social media, has become a breeding ground for extremist ideologies, including white supremacy.
Yeah, I can see how it's a double-edged sword.
Yeah.
On the one hand,
A powerful tool for connection.
yeah, you can connect with anybody in the world.
Yeah.
But then it's also this platform for spreading hate and misinformation.
Exactly. And it's particularly effective for recruitment.
Oh, really?
Yeah. You see these platforms, they create echo chambers
Yeah.
where individuals with similar views can connect.
Yeah.
And they can reinforce each other's beliefs.
Yeah.
And often they're pushing each other further down the rabbit hole.
So you may think that this is all, in the past, but this is very much alive and well.
Absolutely.
Right under our noses.
Yeah. And they're not wearing the hoods on their profile pictures.
No, not at all.
They're using...
They're using dog whistles and memes and all sorts of things to spread their messages and attract new recruits.
So that anonymity is incredibly empowering to them.
Absolutely.
They could say things that they would never say.
Face to face.
Face to face.
Yeah, and it makes it incredibly difficult to track and combat. Okay, so we've talked about how this ideology is showing up in our institutions online. What about just our culture at large?
Yeah.
How does this article talk about how white supremacy intersects with other forms of oppression?
Yeah, this is a really important point. And the article really emphasizes that white supremacy doesn't exist in isolation.
Okay.
It's interwoven with things like sexism,
Right.
xenophobia, homophobia, and these other forms of discrimination to really create this very complex web of oppression.
So it's not just about two separate issues. It's about how they
Compound and
amplify.
amplify. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so what are some of the examples that the article highlights?
Well, let's start with sexism.
Okay.
The article really highlights how both sexism and white supremacy really work together to devalue women,
Okay.
particularly women of color.
Yeah.
Think about the historical and ongoing objectification and exploitation of black women.
Right.
This is a direct result of both white supremacy and sexism working hand in hand.
So it's not just about addressing sexism
Awesome, right.
or white supremacy.
You have to recognize how they intersect and tackle those complexities.
Wow.
Yeah.
And I guess that intersectionality extends to other forms of oppression, too.
Absolutely.
So you've got, like, xenophobia.
You know, the article talks about how xenophobia is fueled by this desire to maintain a white-dominated society.
So immigrants, refugees, anybody who doesn't fit into that very narrow definition of belonging is a target.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that fear of the other often manifests in policies and rhetoric that demonize immigrants, making them scapegoats for societal problems.
It's a classic tactic.
It is.
Yeah. And what about the intersection with homophobia?
You know, the article points out the specific challenges faced by LGBTQ plus individuals, especially those who are also racialized. It emphasizes that within the LGBTQ plus community, there are further layers of oppression based on race and ethnicity.
So you're saying that, like, a black gay man, for example, might face different challenges than a white gay man.
He's navigating homophobia, but he's also navigating racism. And those forms of oppression intertwine to create a unique and often more difficult experience.
And that's especially true probably for black transgender women.
Absolutely.
Because they're targeted for their race, their gender identity, and their sexual orientation.
And they face alarming rates of violence and discrimination because of it.
Yeah, it's a sobering reminder that to dismantle white supremacy, you need to address all of these other
All of it.
intersecting forms of oppression.
Yeah, it's not enough to just fight for one cause in isolation.
Yeah.
We have to recognize the interconnectedness of these issues and understand that true liberation requires a holistic approach.
Yeah.
And as we think about moving forward, it's not just about tearing down the old, structures.
Right.
It's also about building something new,
Yeah.
creating a society where everyone has the opportunity to thrive.
So where do we even begin?
Well, one crucial step in the article touches on this is challenging those dominant narratives
Right.
that perpetuate these harmful ideologies.
So you mean like,
It's about giving space
okay,
for marginalized voices and perspectives to be heard and amplified.
for so long, the stories we've been told,
Right.
the narratives
Yeah.
that shape our understanding of history and society,
Exactly.
it's all been from a white Eurocentric perspective.
Exactly. So part of the work is deconstructing those dominant narratives
Mm-hmm.
and creating space for new stories to be told, stories that reflect the diverse experiences of all people.
So it's about representation.
Absolutely.
Making sure that people from all backgrounds see themselves
Yeah.
in positions of power in the media,
Mhm.
in our education system.
Representation matters
Mhm.
because it sends a powerful message about who belongs, who is valued, and who has a voice.
So it's about shifting those power dynamics
Mhm.
and making sure the stories we tell
Yes.
are more inclusive and reflective of the world we actually live in.
That's a great way to put it. And that leads us to another important aspect of this work, which is building empathy and understanding across different communities.
Yeah, we touched on this a little bit earlier,
I did.
but white supremacy thrives on division, fear of the other.
Right. So breaking down those barriers,
Yeah.
creating opportunities for people from different backgrounds to connect and to really see each other's humanity is crucial.
Yeah.
And one way to do that is through intergroup dialogue programs.
What's that?
These programs bring people from different racial and ethnic backgrounds together for facilitated conversations about racism, and their own lived experiences.
So it's like creating that safe space
Exactly.
for people to share their story.
To listen to each other, to challenge their own assumptions and biases.
Yeah.
And through these dialogues, people can start to really grasp the complexities of race and racism and begin to build relationships that are based on empathy and respect.
It's that reminder that we all have something to learn from each other and that our shared humanity
Yes.
is much stronger than those forces that are trying to divide us.
I couldn't agree more. Now, alongside these personal efforts, we need to be thinking about systemic solutions as well.
Yeah, because it's great to encourage dialogue and understanding, but we also need to look at the actual policies and practices that are perpetuating this inequality and discrimination.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
This is where advocacy and activism come in.
Okay.
We need to be pushing for policy changes in areas like criminal justice reform, education, healthcare, housing, employment.
So changing the systems that disproportionately harm people of color,
Mm-hmm.
creating a more equitable playing field.
Yes, and it's not just about changing the policies themselves,
Okay.
but it's also holding institutions accountable
Right.
for their actions.
So calling out racism and discrimination when we see it.
Demanding that institutions take concrete steps to address these problems.
It's about using our voices.
Collective power.
Yeah, our collective power
Yes.
to push for real lasting change.
And that brings us to another important piece of this puzzle, which is supporting and amplifying the work of organizations that are already on the front lines
Yeah.
fighting white supremacy.
There are so many people out there.
There are.
Doing incredible work.
Yeah, so how can we support them?
Yeah.
Well, donating to organizations like the Southern Poverty Law Center or showing up for racial justice is a great place to start. But it's not just about financial contributions.
Okay.
Volunteering our time.
Right.
Spreading awareness about their work.
Yeah.
These actions can make a real difference too.
So it's realizing that we're part of a larger movement
Yes.
and that every action we take, even if it feels small, can contribute to a collective impact.
I love that. And speaking of individual actions, we shouldn't underestimate the importance of self-education and reflection.
Yeah.
You know, this work starts with each of us examining our own biases and being willing to learn and grow.
I mean, there are so many resources out there.
There are.
Like books, articles, documentaries that can help us really understand, racism, white supremacy.
It's a continuous journey of learning and unlearning.
Yeah.
And it requires a commitment to lifelong growth. But it's absolutely essential if we want to be true allies in this fight.
And that internal work
Yes.
needs to translate into external action.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
We need to be having these conversations with our families, our friends, our communities.
Challenging racist jokes.
Yeah.
Calling out stereotypes.
Right.
Being willing to have those tough conversations about race and racism.
And those conversations can be so challenging.
They can.
Especially if you're talking with people who have very different views than you.
What advice does the article give?
Yeah.
Well, it stresses the importance of approaching these conversations with empathy
Okay.
and a genuine willingness to listen. You know, it's not about shaming or blaming people.
Right.
It's about helping them to understand the impact of their words and actions and inviting them to be part of the solution.
And sometimes it's about knowing when to step back.
Yes, setting boundaries,
Yeah.
recognizing that we don't have to engage in every conversation,
Right.
especially if it's becoming unproductive or harmful.
Because we need to protect our own
Well-being.
well-being and mental health.
Exactly. Sometimes the most powerful action we can take is simply refusing to participate in spaces where hate and bigotry are tolerated.
And this work can be emotionally exhausting.
It can.
The article talks about the importance of self-care.
Yes.
And I think that's so important to keep in mind.
We need to find ways to recharge our batteries, to connect with communities that support us, to engage in activities that bring us joy and help us to find peace. You know, we can't pour from an empty cup.
That's a good analogy.
Yeah.
If we want to do this work sustainably,
Mm-hmm.
show up fully.
We have to take care of ourselves.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And amidst all the challenges, it's crucial to celebrate the victories as well.
Because you can get bogged down with how big of a problem it is.
Absolutely. And it's easy to lose sight of the fact that things are changing.
Yeah.
We're seeing more and more people speaking out against injustice, demanding accountability, and working towards a more equitable world.
And we are seeing real policy changes, shifts in cultural norms,
We are.
a growing awareness.
It's important to recognize those wins, no matter how small they may seem.
Yeah.
They give us hope, and they motivate us to keep fighting.
Yeah, they remind us that our actions do have an impact
They do.
and that we're part of a larger movement for change.
We are. But to keep that momentum going, I think it's crucial to have a vision for the future.
Okay.
You know, the article talks about imagining a world without white supremacy.
What does that look like to you?
That's such a powerful question. And it really requires us to think beyond the limitations of our current reality. For me, a world without white supremacy is a world where everyone, regardless of their race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, or any other aspect of their identity, has the opportunity to thrive.
Where everyone feels safe,
Safe,
respected,
valued for who they are. It's a world where differences are celebrated, not feared, and where we all recognize that our diversity is our strength.
It's a world where we're all interconnected.
Yes.
And we work together to create a just and sustainable future.
Beautifully said. It's a world where history is taught accurately and honestly, so that future generations can learn from the past and build a better future. It may seem like a distant dream, but I truly believe it's a vision worth fighting for.
Yeah, and I think that vision can guide our actions
It can.
and fuel our hope as we continue this crucial work.
Well said. And on that note, let's take a moment to shift our focus to the present. The article highlights a couple of recent tragic events that really underscore the urgent need for this work.
You're talking about the 2017 Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville and the 2019 El Paso Walmart shooting.
Both events were horrific displays of white supremacist violence, and they serve as stark reminders that this isn't some abstract problem. This has devastating, real-world consequences.
Let's start with Charlottesville.
Okay.
That rally drew a wide range of white supremacist groups.
It did.
And it ended with violence, chaos, and the death of Heather Heyer, a counter-protester who was standing up against hate.
It was a horrific display of bigotry,
Mm-hmm.
and it really forced the nation to confront the fact that white supremacy is not a relic of the past.
Right.
It's a clear and present danger.
And then just 2 years later, we had the El Paso shooting, a targeted attack on the Latinx community.
Yes.
The shooter, driven by anti-Hispanic hate, fueled by white supremacist ideology, murdered 23 innocent people.
It was a devastating tragedy, and it really highlighted that dangerous link between online radicalization and real-world violence.
Yeah.
You know, the shooter had posted a manifesto online that echoed white supremacist rhetoric.
Right.
And it really demonstrated how these ideologies can spread and fester in these online spaces.
But both of these events, as horrific as they were,
Mm-hmm.
they also sparked a wave of activism and resistance.
They did.
People took to the streets to demand change, to
Right.
speak out against hate.
And in the face of these tragedies, we also see inspiring individuals and organizations rise up to challenge white supremacy.
The article mentions a few key figures
It does.
and groups.
Mm-hmm.
Let's talk about Ibram X. Kendi.
Okay.
His work on anti-racism has been so influential.
Kendi's work is so important because it challenges us to move beyond simply being not racist
Right.
and
Right.
to actively engage in anti-racist work.
Yeah.
His book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, has become a must-read for anyone who wants to dismantle racism.
I love how he reframes that conversation.
Mm.
It's not just not racist.
Right.
It's about being actively
Actively anti-racist.
anti-racist. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then there's organizations like the Southern Poverty Law Center.
Mm-hmm. The SPLC.
Yeah, the SPLC.
Yeah.
They've been on the front lines of this fight
But
for decades.
Yeah.
They track and expose hate groups. They provide these essential resources to
Well-
help people understand the dangers of white supremacy. And they advocate for policy changes that protect these communities
Absolutely. They're an invaluable resource.
that are targeted by hate.
Yes.
Yeah.
And alongside these national organizations, there are countless grassroots groups
Yeah,
that are working on a local level to combat white supremacy.
right.
The article mentions Showing Up for Racial Justice, SURJ, as a prime example of how people are coming together to create change in their own communities.
Yeah, SRRJ focuses on mobilizing white people
Yes.
to be allies in the fight against racism.
Mm-hmm.
And they do incredible work in terms of education, advocacy, and community organizing.
It's a reminder that we all have a role to play in this fight, and that even small actions can contribute to a larger movement for justice.
Well, I think that's a perfect place to pause for now. We've covered a lot of ground,
We have.
but there's still so much more to explore.
Yes. In our final segment, we'll delve deeper into the concept of allyship and examine some concrete actions that we can all take to dismantle white supremacy and build a more just and equitable world.
So we've talked about a lot,
We have.
the history,
Mm-hmm.
the current, how it's showing up today.
Yeah.
This deep-rooted nature of white supremacy.
Mm-hmm.
But what can we actually do about it?
Yeah.
I think a lot of people feel overwhelmed by this. Like,
Yeah.
what can
What can one person do?
one person do? Yeah.
Yeah, and that's a common feeling.
Yeah.
But I think what's important to remember is that individual actions,
Right.
when multiplied, can create a collective impact.
Okay.
And one of the most powerful things we can do
Mm-hmm.
is to become active allies.
Okay, so what does active allyship look like in this context?
Well, it all starts with education.
Okay.
We need to constantly be learning about the history and the ongoing realities of racism and white supremacy.
So it's more than just reading a book or two.
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
It's about actively seeking out diverse perspectives, engaging with those difficult conversations.
So it's not just passive learning.
No.
It's about applying it. Okay, so besides education, what else can we do?
Well, we need to be willing to have those tough conversations with our family and friends. Call out racism and discrimination when we see it. Use our privilege to amplify marginalized voices.
So speaking up, even when it's uncomfortable.
Absolutely.
Using our platforms to elevate the voices of those
Yes.
who are often silenced.
And supporting organizations that are doing this work on the ground.
Right.
Donating to groups like the SPLC, SURJ, even local grassroots organizations
Yeah.
can make a real difference.
And showing up.
Yeah.
Right.
Attending rallies,
Protests.
community events,
Events.
really demonstrating solidarity and sending that message
Yeah.
that we're not going to tolerate this hate and injustice,
Yeah.
putting our bodies on the line, being
Yeah.
visible in our support.
Mm-hmm.
Those actions speak volumes.
Okay.
But allyship also requires us to hold ourselves accountable.
Yeah, we all have blind spots.
We
We all make mistakes.
It's about being open to feedback, learning from those mistakes,
Yeah.
and committing to doing better.
So it's this continuous process of self-reflection and growth.
Absolutely. It's
Yeah.
not a one-time thing we can check off our list.
Right.
True allyship isn't about seeking praise or recognition.
Right.
It's about doing the right thing because it's the right thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
Because we recognize our shared humanity and we understand that none of us are free until we're all free.
Wow, that's powerful.
Yeah.
So listeners, as we wrap up this deep dive,
Mm-hmm.
remember that the fight against white supremacy,
Yeah.
this isn't someone else's responsibility.
No.
It's ours, each and every one of us.
We all have a role to play.
Yeah, we all have a role to play in dismantling these systems of oppression and
Yes.
building a more just and equitable world.
So start by educating yourself, challenging your own biases,
Yeah.
having those tough conversations,
Yeah.
supporting organizations that are fighting for racial justice, and show up for marginalized communities in concrete ways.
Yeah. Remember, even small actions
They do.
can make a difference.
Your voice matters. Your actions matter.
And together, we
Yeah.
can create a world where everyone has the opportunity to thrive.
A world where justice and equality prevail.
Thank you for joining us on the Deep Dive.
Thanks for listening, everybody.
Until next time, stay curious, stay engaged, and keep fighting for a better world.